sektör. Tabii.
organizasyonunda peki geldi. Tamam, o zaman kaydım.
Yanlış.
Evet.
Hangi serverda görüşmek istiyorsunuz? Hangi IP görüşmek istiyorsunuz?
Ya, bizim serverımız şeydi, Atlas Online'ın omurgasında bizim serverımız var.
Ya oraya da erişim verebiliriz.
Yardımcı olun.
Benim kardeş.
Vakfı'nın merhum bağışçısı Nirun Şahingiray adına düzenlediği uluslararası forumumuza hoş geldiniz. Açış konuşmasını yapmak üzere Türkiye Eğitim Gönülleri Vakfı Yönetim Kurulu üyesi Sayın Oktay Özilci'yi kürsüye davet ediyoruz.
Yes, dear contributors and guests, a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to the second Nirun Şahingiray Forum organized by the Educational Volunteers of Turkey with cooperation of Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government, and Kadir University's 7th Civil Society Days. So our sincere thanks to them. Dear guests, today we have distinguished speakers and participants among us. With this short introduction in English, I would like to thank all of them on behalf of all the organizers and yourselves for accepting our invitations and adding value to the discussion topic of today. I also thank you for joining us and for the lively discussions I'm sure we will have later on. This is the chance to get most out of them, so take the floor when the time comes. Değerli misafirler, TG Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı olarak hepinize hoş geldiniz demekten büyük mutluluk duyuyorum. Bu yıl ikincisini düzenlediğimiz Nirun Şahingiray Uluslararası Forumu'nu ilgi ile izleyeceğinizi umuyorum. Önce Kadir Üniversitesi'ne etkin ve samimi paydaşlığı ve mükemmel ev sahipleri için, Harvard Kennedy School of Government'da değerli işbirliği için, sayın konuşmacılara katkıları için ve başta Suat kardeş olmak üzere organizasyon komitesine bu etkinliği uzun çabalar sonucu gerçekleştirdikleri için peşin teşekkürlerimi sunarım. 20. yılını idrak eden TGV'nin varoluş nedeni ilk öğretim çağındaki çocuklarımıza devlet tarafından verilen eğitime katkıda bulunmak ve onlara yaşam becerileri kazandırmaktır. Bu amaçla Cumhuriyetimizin temel ilke ve değerlerine bağlı düşünen, sorgulayan, özgüven sahibi, din, dil, ırk, cinsiyet farkı gözetmeyen birimler olarak yetişmelerine destek olacak programları düzenliyoruz ve uyguluyoruz. İnancımız, ülkemizi geleceğe ancak iyi eğitimli, akılcı, sağduyulu ve donanımlı çocukların taşıyacağıdır. En büyük gücümüz olan bağışçılarımızın desteği ile 20 yılda 2 milyonu aşan çocuğa ulaşmış olmanın gururu içerisindeyiz. 2008 yılında aramızdan ayrılan değerli mütevellimiz, büyük bağışçımız Nirun Şahingiray'da hatırı sayılır mal varlığının büyük kısmını vakfımıza bağışlayarak ciddi bir kaynağa kavuşmamıza imkan sağlamıştır. Bu forumun gerçekleşmesini de sağlayan Nirun Bey'i tekrar şükran ile anıyoruz. Değerli misafirler, sivil toplum dünyası ve gönüllü kuruluşların da dünyanın içinde bulunduğu global büyüme ve etkileşimin ve hızlı teknoloji devriminin dışında kalması mümkün değildi. Zaten öyle de olmadı. İki farklı yönden gelen iki ayrı akımın gönüllü kuruluşların anlayış ve çalışma şeklini yeniden dizayn ettiğini görüyorum. Gelişmiş ve gelişmekte olan ülkelerdeki refah artışı, insani ve toplumsal değerlerin daha çok öne çıkmasını ve öncelik kazanmasını sağlıyor. Bu konularda gelişen hassasiyet ve organize olarak bir şeyler başarma arzusu gönüllü kuruluşların sayısını artırıyor. Ancak aynı hızla gelişip büyümeyen kaynak havuzundan tabii ki daha çok kullanıcı istifade etmek istiyor. Başka bir ifadeyle kaynağını arayıp bularak projesini gerçekleştiren kuruluşların sayısı artıyor ve rekabet oluşuyor. Bir diğer önemli akım teknoloji devrimi. Bunun getirdiği imkanlar, kolaylıklar, yeni yaklaşımlar, tasarruf ve bilgi bolluğu ezberleri bozuyor, güncel deyim ile paradigmaları değiştiriyor. Bu iki akım, sosyal projelere kaynak aktarabilecek kuruluşların veya bağışçıların proje seçimi yapabilme imkanlarını artırıyor ve daha talepkar oluyorlar. Başka bir ifadeyle aktardıkları kaynağın sadece nereye gittiğini görmek değil, ne kadar etkin kullanıldığının da ispatlanması kazanmasını istiyorlar. Zaten birçoğunun yöneticileri de kendileri benzer hesabı vermek zorundalar. Bu da amatör usulleriyle yapılan uygulamalar ve sadece duygusal ihtiyaçlara cevap veren müferit çalışmalar ile mümkün değil. Profesyonel çatılara ve iş modellerine gerek olur. Ancak o zaman proje verimliliği, fayda maliyet analizi ve fizibilite, rentabilite hesapları yapabiliyor ve belgeleyebiliyorsunuz. Özellikle uygulamacı kuruluşlar olarak bizler hem projeyi oluştururken beklenen faydayı ölçülebilir bir şekilde ortaya koymalıyız, hem de uygulamamızı raporlayacak ölçme ve değerlendirme mekanizmalarına sahip olmalıyız. Global çapta büyük sosyal projeler, global kuruluşların yine global kuruluşlara veya devletlere veya resmi kuruluşlara sağladığı fonlar ve kullanımı işin içine politik faktörler girdiği için bizim konumuz değil. Ancak aynı sorun büyütülmüş ölçekte onlar için de geçerli. Biz TEGEP olarak ölçme ve değerlendirme fonksiyonu proje yönetimi sürecinin içine yerleştirme ve uygulama konusunda belli bir seviyeye geldiğimize inanıyoruz. Hem bildiklerimizi paylaşarak bir fayda yaratmayı, hem de uzman kişilerin konuları tartışarak hepimizde bir farkındalık sağlamasını ve ev ödevi çıkartabilmemizi arzu ediyoruz. Konuşmacılara konunun önemini vurguladıkları, konuyu toplum gündemine taşımamıza destek ve öncülük yaptıkları için teşekkür ediyor. Katılımcıların da bekledikleri çıktıları ve kazanımları almalarını temenni ediyorum. Saygılarımla.
Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi Kadir Üniversitesi Yaşam Boyu Eğitim Merkezi Direktörü ve Türkiye Kurumsal Sosyal Sorumluluk Derneği Başkanı Sayın Serdar Dinler'i açış konuşmasını yapmak üzere kürsüye davet ediyoruz.
Hepiniz hoş geldiniz diyorum. İki şapkam var biraz önce arkadaşın da bahsettiği gibi. Kadir Üniversitesi Yaşam ve Eğitim Merkezi ve aynı zamanda Türkiye Kurumsal Sosyal Sorumluluk Derneği Başkanıyım. Rektör hocamız bizimle birlikte olacaktı bugün ama bugün aynı saatte bir başka salonda başka bir açılış var. Ona bizden daha önce söz verdiği için orada olması gerektiğini söyledi. Belki bize de uğrayabilir, her zamanlamayı ayarlayabilirse. Ama ben bugün üniversiteden çok sivil toplum şapkamla konuşacağım. Öyle konuşmayı tercih ediyorum. Onun için beni bir Kurumsal Sosyal Sorumluluk Derneği Başkanı, bir sivil toplumcu olarak dinlemenizi rica ediyorum. Evet, ben de hem Kadir Üniversitesi'ne, çünkü 7 yıldır bu etkinliği yapmak için derneğimize bu konuda müsaade vermiş, ev sahipliği yapıyor. Hem de Kadir Şapkan'la Türkiye Kurumsal Sosyal Sorumluluk Derneği'ne ve bu sene bu çalışmada bizimle birlikte olan ve etkinliğimize çok daha farklı anlamlar yükleyen TEGEV'e de çok teşekkür ediyorum. Böyle bir ortaklıkla bizimle birlikte oldukları için. Ve bu sene de hepinizin bildiği gibi de temamız STK'larda ölçme, değerlendirme olarak adlandırılmıştır. Ve bu temayı da Nirun Şahingiray anısına düzenlenen forumla değerlendirmek de ayrıca bizim için bir onurdur. Bunu da bu vesileyle andığımız için çok mutluyum. Sivil toplum, STK'lar. Ben hep şöyle bir sorunun cevabını aradım sivil toplumcu olarak. Biz kimiz ve ne yapıyoruz? Nereye ulaşmaya çalışıyoruz? Bunu çeşitli yerlere sordum. Mesela anneme sorarsanız, annem diyor ki, oğlum diyor, dün Avrupa Birliği'ndeydi, komisyon salonunda orada konuşma yaptı. Yok New York'ta Birleşmiş Milletler dedi, yok Türkiye'de. Ve benim bu tip yerlerde konuşmalar yaptığımı, sürekli bunları yaptığımı düşünerek çok gururlanıyorum. Arkadaşlarıma sorarsanız, onlar diyor ki ya gene diyor dün Brüksel'deymişsin, o keyfin yerinde toplantıya gittin, gene değişik yerler gördün, değişik yemekler yedin. Arkadaşlarım da bizim böyle keyifli anlar yaşadığımızı sürekli düşünüyor. Topluma sorarsanız evde bir yardım sandığı ya Türkiye'nin ya da uluslararası bir yerde Afrika'da yardım dağıttığını düşünüyor. Hatta Van depreminden sonra çok telefon aldım. ve telefonu ilk açtıklarında banda mısın diye sordular sürekli bana. Ama çok benim alanıma girmediği için bana gitmemiştim. Ama o kadar çok telefon geldi ki sonra hakikaten utandım. Niye banda değilim, niye banda bir şey yapmadım diye, ama gene biz kendi çapımızda burada bir takım destekler, yardımlar toplayarak da göndermiştik. Böyle de rahatlamıştık aslında. Donor organizasyonlara, döner organizasyonlara sorduğumuzda onlar da şöyle zannediyorlar bizi. Ya biz parayı veriyoruz, siz seminer yapıyorlar ama siz uyuyorlar, kafalar masada. Seminer sırasında işte geçiştiriyorlar gibi düşünüyorlar. Çalıştaylarda, seminerlerde. Bize sorarsanız biz de dünyada işte tüm sorunları çözdük, barış getirdik, huzur getirdik, mutluluk getirdik, hepimiz kardeşiz diye, onu sağladık diye düşünüyoruz. Ama gerçek çok farklı. Aslında gerçek baktığımız zaman biz bürokrasinin altında eziliyoruz. Devlet hesap soruyor sürekli bize, donor kuruluşlar sürekli hesap soruyor, medya peşimizde sürekli hesap soruyor, uluslararası kuruluşlar hesap soruyor. Yani 3 kuruş parayı veren 50 kuruşluk da hesap soruyor bize. Evet, böyle bir sıkıntı yaşayan STK'lara gene bu soruyu biraz daha irdeleyip, geçmişe çok daha eskilere gitmeye çalıştım kendi kendime. Ve ilk aklıma sivil toplumla ilgili 7 yaşında ilkokul 1'deyken sömestrin bitmesine birkaç hafta kadar 2 tane sarı zarfla tanıştım ben sivil toplumda. 2 tane sarı zarf ve üzerinde ne kadar bağış yapacağınız yazıyordu. 5, 10, 15, 20 diye rakamlar vardı. Dediler ki bunu babana götür, babam bunun içine para koyacak, onu da işaretleyip imzalayacak, yapıştırıp arkasına. Kızılay ve Türk Hava Kurumu adlı 2 tane kurumdu. İşte Cumhuriyet'in erken dönemlerinde emekli bürokratlar tarafından veya siyasetçiler tarafından kurulmuş ilk 2 sivil toplumdu. Oradan buraya pek etkilenmedim. Onun için biraz daha geriye gittim ben. Araştırdım, baktım, inceledim ve ben en çok sivil toplumculara, sivil toplum lideri kime benzettim biliyor musunuz? Karşıma kim çıktı? Kristof Kolomb. Biz Kristof Kolomb gibiyiz galiba. Öyle algılıyorum ben sivil toplumcuları. Çünkü ne yaptı Kristof Kolomb? İşte 1490'lı yıllarda 3 Ağustos gibi bir gündü galiba. Etrafına topladığı 200 kişilik bir mürettebatla Santa Maria, Nina ve Pinta isimli gemilerle Palos limanından ayrılarak batıya doğru yola çıktı. Evet, ve bu seferi yapmak için de İspanya Kraliçesi 1. Isabel'i ikna etti. Isabel de çok enteresan bir kadındır. Isabel, Engizisyon ve din temelli temsil politikasının sorumlusu ve Kristof Kolomb'un da hamisidir. Aslında benim için tarihin en kötü kalpli kadınlarından birisidir Isabel. Ve tahminen de Kristof Kolomb 1497 veya 1499 yılları arasında Amerika kıtasına ulaştı. Ve orayı Doğu Hindistan zannetti. Orada yaşayan insanlara da Hintli dedi, Indiyo ve yerli Amerikalılar da böylelikle Indian olarak kaldı. Evet, diyeceksiniz ki ne alakası var sivil toplumla? Aslında biz de böyleyiz galiba. Biz de topluyoruz etrafımıza 5-10 arkadaşımızı, oturuyoruz, bir şeyler geliştiriyoruz, bir yola çıkmak için. Çıkıyoruz yola ve bütün bunları da başkasının parasıyla yapıyoruz, donorların parasıyla. Başarılı oluyoruz, başarısızlık olarak, bunu olumsuz olarak halletmiyorum. Ama sivil toplumcu sanırım kaşif gibi sürekli projeler geliştirip seferlere giden, mürettebatla ekibiyle seferlere giden ve sonunda bir yerleri keşfeden, zaman zaman da belki keşif sırasında yanılan bir grup diye. Dediğim gibi bu soruyu kendime çok sormamın sebebi aslında biz yabancılaştık mı diye düşünüyorum kendi kendimize, sivil toplumcular olarak. İşlerimiz hala önemliyken acaba etkimiz mi azaldı diye çok düşünüyorum. Kısacası sivil toplum olarak biz neredeyiz, nereye gidiyoruz diye düşünüyorum. Bugünlere bakarken aslında bugünlerde kurumlar, şirketler, medya, akademi, kamu ve birçok başka sivil toplum örgütleri birçok riskler alıyor. Mesela şirketler riskler alıyor ve bu riskleri aldıktan sonra riskler tutmayınca ekonomik krizler çıkıyor. Mesela devletler riskler alıyor, devletleri de bu riskler tutmayınca zaman zaman savaşlar çıkıyor, mücadele oluyor. Yani etrafımız yüksek riskler alan kumarbazlarla dolu. Bu risklerin sonucunda da ortaya çıkan toplumsal yaraları da sarmak biz sivil toplumculara düşüyor. Yani biz bir tür hasta bakıcılığı rolü yapıyoruz gibi bugünlerde. Evet, sağlık hizmetinde 2 tür sağlık hizmeti vardır. Eğer sağlık konusunda çalışma yapmış olanınız varsa. Bir koruyucu sağlık hizmeti vardır, bir de tedavi edici sağlık hizmeti. Ama biz nedense hiç koruyucuya Türkiye'nin önem tedavi edecek. Yani olay olduktan sonra biz sivil toplumcuların tedavi etmeye başladığı gibi. Evet. Yıllarca hasta bakıcının rolümüzde toplumsal yaralara tedavi olmaya çalışıyoruz. Ancak bugün tedavi edici rolümüzün yanında koruyucu rolümüzün de olması gerektiğini düşünüyorum. Neden tedavi edici olmalıyız? Çünkü toplumun nabzı bizim elimizde. Nabzı biz tutuyoruz, tansiyonu biz ölçüyoruz, kalp atışlarını biz sayıyoruz sivil toplumcular olarak. Bu nedenle de biz de sürekli toplumsal hastalıklar konusunda da roller veriyor. Ancak toplumun bir başka sıkıntısı da, işte sivil toplumun bir başka sıkıntısı da aslında donör bağımlısı olması. Yani hala ekonomik özgürlüğünü sağlamış değil. Donör ne derse, donör hangi alanda para verirse, şu alanda çalışma yap derse biz hemen amaçlarımızdan sapıyor ve o amaca dönüyoruz. Ben sivil toplum olarak artık donör bağımlısı değil, donör yöneten bir durumda dönmeliyiz diye düşünüyorum. İşte kapitalizm bu. Riskler ve büyük yaralar, yaraları da sivil toplum sarar. Geleceğe bakarsak işte aslında görüntü çok yakın bir gelecekte her şeyin ama her şeyi özelleştireceğini gösteriyor bize. Eğitimin, sağlığın, güvenliğin ve hatta adaletin hemen hemen her şey özelleşecek. Artık kamu bu tip hizmetleri vermek için borçlanmaya ihtiyaç duymayacak. Artık bizler borçlanacağız. Kamu borçlanmayacak bu hizmetler için. Hani derler ya her çocuk doğduğunda şu kadar miktar parayla işte $1000 borçla doğar diye. Evet bu artık doğru olacak. Gerçek doğar doğmaz onların hanelerine borç yazılacak ve o borçlar ileride çalışma hayatına geldiğinde teker teker kazandığı paralarla düşecek. Evet biz sivil toplum aktivistleri ayrımcılığa karşı mücadele ettik. Epey de yol aldık. Artık tam ve mükemmel olmasa da birçok alanda yani din, ırk, milliyet, cinsiyet benzeri konulardaki ayrımcılıklarda epey bir azalma olduğunu düşünüyor, bir farkındalık yarattığımızı hissediyorum. Ama önümüzdeki dönemdeki ayrımcılık çok farklı ayrımcılık olacak. Bunlar mesela fakir, zengin ayrımcılığı şeklinde olacak. Sağlık, paramız yoksa sağlık hizmeti alamayacağız. Para yoksa adalet hizmeti alamayacağız. Para yoksa güvenlik satın alamayacağız, eğitim satın alamayacağız ve büyük bir ayrımcılığa uğrayacak bu ekonomik para gücü olmayan büyük kitleler. Önümüzdeki dönemde de biz de bu değişime uygun olarak yeni rollere talip olmalıyız diye düşünüyorum. Bizler bence artık tedavi edici, hasta bakıcılığından çok sigorta olmalıyız. Artık sigortacılık rolüne bürünmeliyiz diye düşünüyorum. Bu nedenle bilmemiz gereken risk analizi yapmak, risk hesabı yapmak. Bunu öğrenmeliyiz diye düşünüyorum. Çünkü gelecekte güvenin yeni adresi STK'lar olacaktır diye düşünüyorum. Güven artı güç eşittir sosyal diye bir formülize edebiliriz bunu. Neden güven? Sosyal kalkınma için. Neden güven? Toplum içerisinde huzur için. Özgürlük için, akıl için, güç için. Güzellik için güven. Sivil toplumu güven çağının başladığını düşünüyorum ve biz de önümüzdeki dönemlerde sigortacı rolümüzle güven oluşturmalıyız toplum için diye düşünüyorum. Ve bize geldiğiniz için tekrar çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sağ olun.
Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi forumun sunuş bölümünü yapmak ve öğleden önceki konuşma bölümlerini yönetmek üzere sahneyi Koç Üniversitesi Psikoloji Bölümü öğretim üyesi yardımcı doçent doktor Sayın Yasemin Kisbu Sakarya'ya bırakıyoruz.
Dear all, I would like to again welcome you to Nirun Şahingiray Forumu-1 Measurement and Evaluation non-profit organizations organized by the Educational Volunteers Foundation of Turkey with cooperation of Harvard University John Kennedy School of Government and Kadir University Civil Society. The forum is organized in honor of Nirun Şahingiray, who was known for his love for children in his country and who donated his wealth to Education Volunteers Foundation to support the children most in need of educational help in Turkey. The forum, in general, aims to establish an important platform for scholars, social and educational policymakers, business leaders, philanthropists to provide meaningful coverage on current trends and challenges in diverse fields and their impact on education and civil society. The aim of this year's Nirun Şahingiray International Forum is to gather experts and practitioners from all over the world on measurement and evaluation in non-profit sector and discuss and share different aspects of the subject. Measurement and evaluation play a crucial role for non-governmental organizations in capacity building and development, in refining their models of change, engaging in informed decision-making, and providing evidence of their impact in the society. Non-profit organizations implement programs to create a positive change in societies, and here then comes the challenge for them to answer this question. Did your program achieve these goals? Did you effectively create the change you targeted for? And if yes, for whom it worked? In which context? How? And what were the essential components of your program that worked? And of course, what did not work and why? The answers to those questions are all very challenging, and they provide evidence about the impact and efficacy of the program. And here I would like to emphasize again the importance of the word evidence. Researchers, educators, disseminators of the program, policymakers, founders of the program, they want evidence showing that your program works. In the recent years, for instance, many institutes such as the U.S. Institute of Education Sciences and International Society for Prevention Research formed task forces to create the standards of program evaluation in order to set the criteria for what constitutes scientific evidence of impact. This evidence-based approach to evaluation helps to determine credible and scientific information on the effectiveness of a given practice that would eventually inform decision-making on the implementation of those programs, interventions, or policies. Non-governmental organizations determine the problems in the society, and they try to deal with them. And evaluation is part of the sequence of rational problem solving, and it guides public policy. To stay at the cutting edge in the area that they serve, NGOs should continuously evaluate their programs using the scientific standards on impact. And the International Nirun Şahingiray Forum today is going to have a series of presentations and panels on the topics in evaluation with the aim of contributing to the highest standards in the non-profit sector. The forum will be on different aspects of measurement and evaluation in non-profit organizations, such as measurement and evaluation and theory of change, design best measurement and evaluation practices for organizations and programs, impact evaluation, challenges for creating a culture of measurement and evaluation for high-performance non-profits, and measurement and evaluation for sound management. Our first presenter today is Professor Julie Wilson from Harvard John Kennedy School of Government. Julie Wilson is the Hedicon Senior Lecturer in Social Policy and the Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy at Harvard University. She is the faculty co-chair of 2 Harvard Kennedy School executive programs, Performance Measurement for Effective Management for Nonprofit Organizations, and leading successful social programs using evidence to assess effectiveness. Professor Wilson also spent 3 years at the New York State Department of Social Services, where she directed the Office of Program Planning, Analysis and Development. Her teaching and research focuses on poverty policy, family policy, child welfare, and among her recent projects are several case studies on adoption from public agencies, child welfare and justice reform, and community-based strategies for strengthening families' capacities to parent. Dear Professor Wilson, it's an honor to have you here today. Please.
nice introduction. To repeat what some of the earlier speakers have said, you're in a position where everyone wants you to produce evidence about the effectiveness of your nonprofit organization or the program that you run. Your funders want evidence that you're using their resources carefully to accomplish exactly what you said you would do. And if you have more than one funder, you're probably in a situation where each funder wants something slightly different from you for programs that seem quite similar. If Turkey is like the United States, and it certainly sounds like it is based on what the previous speakers have said, the government wants a great deal of information from you about what you're doing and how you're using your resources. Many of your managers probably want evidence that the changes you're proposing to make in the organization are worth the amount of energy and effort they're going to have to put into changing the way they do their job. And even the people to whom you provide services want evidence that if they go through your program, the outcomes are going to be positive for them. So that puts some pressure on us to, and I would add one more thing, if you aren't interested in continuing to find out what works, you wouldn't be here today. So I think all of us are in the same position, feeling external pressures and internal pressures to produce evidence. But it raises a question of what we actually mean by evidence. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of us would have to admit that we're a bit confused. We're not sure what constitutes evidence. We're not sure how to produce it. We have all seen evidence data that we don't trust, or data that have been cherry-picked to make a political point. And we've also all seen those very expensive, scientifically based research studies that have had a major impact but cost more than our budget could allow. And so we're struggling not only with what constitutes evidence, but also with whether we can produce evidence ourselves, and if not, how much money we have to raise to actually produce this evidence. So part of our challenge is that we have a lot of needs for evidence. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. First, some of the evidence that we want would be very useful for managing the day-to-day operations of our organization, while other evidence would convince us that what we're doing on a day-to-day basis really is having a positive impact. A piece of that challenge is some of the evidence is going to take a very long time to gather and to emerge. If we're working with young children with the idea that when they get all the way through school, they will have a better life as an adult, we're talking decades. But between now and then, our program is likely to change, and the people we serve are likely to change, and we also have to manage it effectively over the short term. Finally, gathering evidence can be complicated. In some cases, it's quite easy. In some cases, it's very different. I do a lot of work with child abuse and neglect, and this is an area where it's very difficult to gather some pieces of evidence and set up the kinds of experiments that we might want to set up. These challenges are real, and you're dealing with them on a day-to-day basis. And so the question is, what should your overall strategy be? And how can you possibly do this? Take heart. Nonprofit management has never been for the weak or the faint of heart. You have to be tough to do this, and we're going to help you today figure out exactly how to do it. What SWOT has asked me to do is lay out a framework for you of evidence. And the speakers who follow me will then go into greater depth on each aspect of this framework. And so what I'm going to try to do is tie together what you do day to day as a manager and how you generate evidence for managing your organization with the kind of evidence you also need to generate to show the longer term and shorter term effectiveness of your organization. But first I want to point out that you have a job that is inherently incredibly complex and much more difficult than the challenge of running a for-profit business. First, for-profit businesses have a very straightforward way of measuring success. You either make money or you don't make money. For the nonprofits, we don't have anything quite that simple. it's hard to figure out how we measure success. And the second piece about this aspect of nonprofits is the feedback loop is pretty quick. You will know pretty early whether your product is selling or not selling and whether you're making money or not making money. Now, sometimes there's a lag and it picks up later, but it's a very different situation than we face in a nonprofit organizations. Second, all for-profit organizations can be measured by the same outcome, this profit metric. If you're going to invest for your retirement income, you might want to know a little bit more about share of market and growth and other things. But in the end, you don't want to invest in a for-profit company that's not earning a profit. For nonprofits, we don't have this kind of common metric. How do you compare the long-term benefits of opening an art gallery in a community with the long-term benefits of running a preschool program in a low-income neighborhood? And so for those who are investing in nonprofits, it's hard to know where to put your money, and it's hard for those of us in nonprofits to compete with one another for this money. The final point is that for businesses, those who fund their organization, the purchasers, are also those who benefit from the services of the business. They consume the products for the most part. If they stop purchasing your products, you know that they don't really like them or have shifted to something else. For nonprofits, it's quite different. Those who fund us are not normally the people who use our services. And so we are providing evidence both to funders and to those who are using our services. And these are often very different types of evidence that we need to produce. So the question is, where do you want to start in this process? One of the models that we are developing and implementing through teaching and watching what's going on in nonprofits at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Business School is to start with what we call question zero. Question zero is the challenge of saying in 10 words or less what your organization is trying to do. Now, for some of you, this will be a mission statement. You'll have a very short mission statement. But for most of us, our mission statements are long and they grow over time and they've got a lot of complex pieces. These mission statements serve a very important function. They enable those in the organization, they enable you to motivate the people who work for you to do some really hard work in the face of limited resources and other hardships. They also create a kind of umbrella so that other people doing similar things can understand that they're actually part of your process of what you're going to do. So I'm going to use throughout this talk the example of TEGEV. And if you look at TEGEV's mission, listen carefully to this, it is to create and implement educational programs and extracurricular activities for children aged 7 to 16 so that they can acquire skills, knowledge, and attitudes supporting their development as rational, responsible, self-confident, peace-loving, inquisitive, cognizant, creative individuals who are against any kind of discrimination, respect diversity, and are committed to the basic principles of the Turkish Republic. These are noble goals, and we are all in support of these goals. But I think all of us who are here today also recognize it is very hard to measure whether you've met these goals. For example, how might TEGEV measure the effect of participation in an after-school program on the development of a more peace-loving nature, or on commitment to the basic principles of the Turkish Republic? This is not to say, as I said, that they're not worthy. It's just really hard to tie participation in one after-school program to changes in basic concepts. So we need something much more specific if we want to try to measure the effectiveness of our program. This is where question zero is important. I stepped back a bit. We have developed a teaching case on TEGEV, by the way, and which I taught yesterday to a group of students at the same university. And so in the process, we worked on what the question zero for TEGEV might be. And we came up with the following. Improve long-term child outcomes through volunteer-led after-school education enrichment programs. Now, I obviously benefited from hyphens, so I got a lot into my 10 words. But it is much more precise in terms of evidence than the mission statement. And it doesn't really define enrichment. It doesn't really define long-term outcomes. It leaves those open. But it sets you up for saying, that's how we're going to measure our effectiveness through this outcome. Turns out that developing your question zero takes a lot of time, and in the process you're likely to discover that your top management team and others in your organization have a very different concept of what your question zero is. Part of this is because they are working in different functional areas of your organization, and so they see the world differently. So for example, the question I laid out is from the group in TEGED that is focused on what happens to after-school youth. But TEGED does this by trying to marshal volunteers to actually teach these after-school programs. Another part of their mission is to increase the capacity of the volunteer sector in Turkey. So those in TEGED are responsible for identifying, recruiting, and training volunteers might have a question zero that looks like this. Increase Turkish volunteerism through opportunities to lead after-school enrichment programs. Gets you to the same result, but the emphasis here is on the volunteer aspect as opposed to using volunteers to achieve this result. You can have 2 question zeros, but if you do, you need to acknowledge that you really have 2 quite different missions here, or submissions that you need to focus on, and this is going to affect how you choose evidence. Just as an exercise, I will let you know that a former student, after discovering this concept of question zero, went back to his home organization. It was a nonprofit. He gathered a senior management team. He circulated a piece of paper to each one, explained question zero, and said, write down your question zero for our organization, but don't sign your name. He then gathered the pieces of paper, shuffled them, and passed them out again. It turned out that everyone had a slightly different version of what the question zero for the organization was, and when he asked each to explain another person's concept of the question zero, generated a discussion within his organization about what their true mission was. Now, why should this matter, and why should you start here? And why do you care if people in your organization are in agreement? Because if you're not clear about what you're trying to accomplish, you'll never really know if you've been successful in accomplishing it. And you need to be very clear about this. You need to be very clear about your question zero as you set up your evidence-generating strategy. The next step after your question zero is ask yourself, how do we get there? What's our roadmap? And this is what we call your theory of change. The theory of change is a series of if-then statements. If we do this, then this will happen. And if that happens, then this will happen. And if that happens, then this will happen. So I've created a rough theory of change for TEGED, which, based on their mission and our question zero, that says, if we create safe and inviting environments for after-school activities, then school children will feel comfortable coming to our after-school programs. Or you might say, for the younger kids, their parents will feel comfortable sending them. And if the school children feel comfortable, then we'll be able to offer activities that interest them. And if we offer activities that interest them, then they'll keep coming. This is all voluntary on their part. We have to be the magnet that pulls them in. So if they keep coming, then we can embed enrichment activities into our after-school programs. And if we can embed the enrichment activities, then we can teach them the skills, and if we teach them the skills, that will influence what they're doing. Now, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of this, it is much more detailed. And part of this is because you'll notice that I have not defined safe and inviting environments, or any kind of activities. And it takes time to develop this. So you need to begin by developing your theory of change. You also need to recognize that your theory of change may itself change over time. Partly other actors get into the field and do pieces of it and you drop out. We learn new things. For example, there's a great deal of newly emerging work on adolescent development. We're learning a lot about what we ought to be doing with adolescents and what we shouldn't be doing, and we're realizing a lot of the things we've been doing were really not very good or were not effective at all. So there's lots of reasons that your theory of change will itself change over time. In order to develop your theory of change, you want to draw on research evidence that's already out there, in this case about the development of children and about other programs that might be effective, as well as what we would call common sense, and as well as what you're learning as you run these programs. And we're going to come back to talk about more of what you learn. The reason that it is so important to take the time to develop your theory of change is that that leads directly into your logic model. And a logic model has inputs. We'll come back and talk about these. Some kind of process, something that you're doing, immediate outputs, things that you can count right away, and longer-term outcomes. So I'm going to illustrate this with two examples. First, if you think about this very first statement of creating safe and inviting environments for after-school activities, you have to have a good sense of what you mean by safe and what you mean by inviting. I'm going to focus on safe just because we don't have much time, but just point out that what's inviting for a 7-year-old looks very different than what's inviting for a 16-year-old. So this suggests you're going to have different theories of change and possibly different logic models for different programs. So safe would include spaces without obvious hazards, such as harmful substances, toxic chemicals around, substandard construction, loose wires, that sort of thing, as well as freedom from harassment or harm by peers, teachers, or individuals who are not part of the program. So this then says a lot about what kind of space you need to have, what kind of supervision you need to have, and how and when, and those are your inputs. So a piece of your input is going to be the space, the staff, the money you need to actually do that, the kind of training or supervision you need to make sure it's being done. As you just think about space, the processes are going to be how often do you inspect it and clean it? What are you doing about keeping the space safe? What kind of training are you giving to the teachers so that they know how to diffuse situations with young kids so it doesn't escalate into some kind of bullying or harassment? And your immediate outputs might be something like injuries, absenteeism, incidents of bullying. That's what you know as performance metrics. And you turn them into performance management when you work with your staff to say, we haven't been maintaining this space as well as we ought to be. How can we change our maintenance schedule? How can we do this? How can we do that? You want to be tying your performance metrics directly to your theory of change and your question zero, because they're going to feed in later to more sophisticated, longer-term pieces of evidence. The challenge with outputs is that outputs measure what actually happened, or in some cases what didn't happen. But remember, we said we wanted to create a safe and inviting environment so all kids would feel comfortable attending. The question you want to ask yourself is, who didn't come and why, right? And this is harder information to gather, because it could be that youth didn't come because they hadn't heard about your program. If they had heard about it, they would have come and would have really liked it. It could be that there are some segments of the school population that feel very uncomfortable coming to a program like this. Or it could be that there is something on the part of parents who feel, I don't feel comfortable sending my children to a program like this. Or it could be as simple as some of the older youth have jobs, and If they didn't have a job, they would be at your program. So looking not only at what you observed, but asking the really hard question of what wasn't there, or as those of you who follow Sherlock Holmes know, the dog that didn't bark, that wasn't in the area, is another piece of your performance metric and another piece of evidence about whether your program is meeting your mission. So just to sort of summarize and reiterate on this one, think very hard about performance management and performance metrics and how they are tied into your larger evidence-generating strategy. Now I want to move to a second set of questions, and this says, so how do we know if what we're doing is having any kind of impact or effect on the youth? So here I want you to imagine that TEGA has created an after-school program focused on building robots out of Legos, but the kind of robots that actually do something, you know, like pick up something here, move it, and drop it down here. It's, as I said, it's designed for 12 to 14-year-olds, and the goal is to increase their interest in math and science so that they will take more math and science in school, do better in those courses, and think really hard about a career in math, in some kind of math and science related field. And your theory of change is that if they see math and science as fun, then they'll want to do more of it. And if they see math and science as useful, then they will study harder, and you can sort of play this out to moving on towards a career. So if we go back to our logic model, we start with the inputs, and of course we need Legos, and we need other equipment, we need a space that has access to electrical power, and we need a space that's safe at night so no one comes in and wrecks their robots. And we need to get money for this, obviously. Legos aren't free, although I have a lot in my attic, I could loan you. We also need to recruit volunteer teachers, and the right kind of volunteer teachers who understand about how to build robots, and who also know how to work with youth, right? And we need to recruit the students. So those are the inputs that we want to be thinking about. Now the program involves dividing the students into small working groups, and during their sessions after school every day for 6 weeks, teaching them about the basics of robot construction, and providing opportunities for them to build robots, experiment, test, and rebuild. It might even involve demonstrations to other groups or competitions with the robots. And it also involves helping students learn how to work in a group and diffuse tensions within a group and get these projects built. So what do you want to measure in terms of the effectiveness? The immediate outputs that you might want to look at are attendance. Once they came, did they keep coming back, the students? How engaged were they when they came? Did they actually build any robots? Did they have fun? Did the groups manage to get along and work out differences? There's a lot of immediate outcomes that you can look at to say, yeah, I think the immediate part of this program was successful. But your goal is to do more than just provide after-school activities to fill their time. You want to influence their behavior. So your outcomes a little farther away are also important. You probably want to know if the participating students began working harder in math and science classes. And if it's so, you expect their grades to go up. So you might want to compare their grades before and after the course. You might want to know if they had a chance, if they were in a situation in school where they had a chance to select the courses they took, if they started taking more math and science courses. And you also might want to know if they were beginning to think about careers in math and science and asking questions about that. And you even might want to know if this interest in math and science persisted a year or 2 years after participation in your program. And if it did, you would feel very good. But the big question is, can you take credit if their interest really increases and they start taking more courses, can you take credit for this? The answer is maybe, maybe not. We don't know. And the reason that we don't know is that we don't have a measure of what we call the counterfactual. And the counterfactual is what would have happened to this very same group of kids if they hadn't been in your program. And now they both can't be in your program and not be in your program at the same time. That's an impossibility. But think about this. It could be that only the students who are already really interested in math and science signed up for your program. They had a great time. You know you kept them out of trouble while they were in your program. But they probably would have done just as well in math and science classes and selected the same careers even without your program because that's who they were. On the other hand, suppose you had a group of students who participated who had always done quite well in math and science, but never really liked it or never thought about a career for themselves in math and science. In the United States, we're struggling with the fact that this describes a lot of young women in our school system. Good at math and science, but just don't think that's what women do, and they choose other careers. If you convince them that math and science careers were right for them and they should go forward, you might want to say, yeah, we really made a difference here. And now suppose a third group of students were struggling in math and science, had decided they weren't going to take any more math and science as soon as they didn't have to. They couldn't figure out how it was going to be useful in their lives. And they got excited, and your volunteers worked with them on how to study for math and science. Their grades came up, and your volunteers talked to them about the different kinds of careers they could have building on math and science, and that got them to thinking differently about what they were going to do. You'd feel very good about that. The challenge is we don't know these three scenarios describes your program unless you have a counterfactual. So the counterfactual says on the top row there's a group of students who took my program, and there's a comparison group who didn't. And this comparison group is like the students in my program in every single way except they didn't take my program. And so the difference between, oops, I don't know where that came from. It doesn't like impact analysis. I don't know how to get rid of this. The difference is what we call impact. I know a lot of people use the word impact as though it means we had some kind of an effect. But the precise term, the term impact means that this is the difference that our program added. So let me give you another just brief example to think about this. Imagine you run a training program for jobs, and suddenly the economy falls into recession. No matter how good your training program is, the people who graduate are going to have a hard time finding a job. On the other hand, if the economy is really hot, even if you run a not-so-great training program, people are going to find jobs. You actually don't know, you can't tell, because all this other noise is in the atmosphere unless you have a counterfactual. So the ideal situation is you can put 20 students in your robots course and 40 signed up. You run a lottery and you randomly say, you 20 get in, you 20 don't, and you follow them for a while and see what the difference is. This is the ideal situation because you have no reason to believe these groups are different. But what if everybody who signed up for the program could be accommodated? You don't want to reduce the size of your program just so you can have a counterfactual. You're thinking to yourself, I can compare this group with another after-school program. Well, let me actually stay on the counterfactual, because what will happen to this comparison group in the counterfactual is that some of them will take other after-school programs, some of them will get jobs, some of them will do nothing, some might even find another science program. You don't care because they would have done that if your program hadn't been there, and that's really the question you're asking. Whatever they do is what they would have done without us, and we're looking at what our difference is. So if you don't have enough and you decided to select another program, suppose you said, the same day, same time, there's a program for the same age group that focuses on dance. It's dances from different countries, and you're learning how to do them. Would you feel comfortable comparing the math and science scores from the students from your program with the students from that program? Probably not, because deep inside you have a sense the kind of kid who chooses a dance course versus a robot building course are probably pretty different kids. And it's that difference in these kids that explains what happened in the math and science, not necessarily my program. So the point is, it is not always easy to find a counterfactual. There are very sophisticated statistical methods that you can use to try to create a counterfactual, and this is where calling in outside consultants in some of your situations might be helpful. But there are some things that you can think about built into your management structure that you might not have thought about. And that is, if you're developing a new program and you're implementing it, it's hard to implement the program in every location at one time. So you might want to randomly say, we're going to start in these schools. We're going to put robots in a robot class in these schools, but not in these schools this year. We're going to see what happens. Next year, we'll add a robot course to this set of schools, but not this set of schools, but randomly select these. And that gives you a little power over time. Are you seeing differences? It's not quite the same, but you want to be thinking as a manager, how can I build some of these concepts into the way I develop my programs, into the way I start implementing my programs, and the way I test it. So, finding your counterfactual is not always easy. Even if you do find your counterfactual, and you are able to measure the impact, there are some limitations to randomized experiments, and you should be aware of those. Randomized experiments are elegant and beautiful in their capacity to estimate impact. But they control for the fact, what we call internal validity, the fact that the students who didn't take your program are just like the students who did. If your program turns out to have a positive impact for this group of 12 to 14-year-olds, it doesn't necessarily mean that your program will have the same impact for 16 and 17-year-olds, or for 9 and 10-year-olds. And it doesn't mean that your program will have the same impact for 12 to 14-year-olds in a different part of Turkey or in a different country. Because the external environment is different and something else may be going on. And we have a lot of examples of programs that showed an impact in one area and did not show an impact in another. A very famous one in the United States, the Nurse Home Visiting Program, where nurses went to the homes of low-income mothers who were pregnant and followed them through. They had several groups. Some just got an initial visit. Some they visited them regularly for up to 2 years after the child was born. And they were looking initially at things like low birth weight, live births, birth weight, and early childhood outcomes. The initial program was run in southern New York State, rural, white, and poor, and showed some very positive impacts. It was replicated in the city of Memphis, Tennessee, urban, black, and poor, and it didn't show the same impacts. And one of the things they discovered is the short-term impacts came from convincing low-income white women to stop smoking while they were pregnant and to do less drinking. And it turns out that black women don't smoke. And so that was never an issue that was driving the initial outcomes. Now, another lesson that comes from this is the longer-term outcomes show that even though there weren't very many differences in the short-term outcomes, over the long term it had huge differences. And we can talk about that later. So you want to keep in mind this concept of internal and external validity. The second point is that experiments like this tell you on average whether those who participated in your program performed better than those who didn't participate in your program. But it doesn't necessarily, unless you look very carefully, it doesn't necessarily tell you about the variation in who benefited from your program. So it could be that what there's a group in your program that benefited because they were already interested in math and science and they just jumped ahead. But it could be, going back to my earlier scenario, that your program had a really big impact not on the boys who were already interested in math and science and thought they were going forward, but on those girls who were interested, who were good in math and science, but hadn't really thought about it. And so on average, everyone came up, but the group that was really benefiting was the girls. And so you want to, as you think about doing these, have a large enough sample and enough statistical power, others are going to talk about this later, to be able to say, this is who we really affected. This program had an impact, particularly for this group. Now, I want to make one final point, and that is to go back to the TAGEV mission statement, which we said they're very broad goals, they're important goals, and TAGEV can't accomplish this mission all alone. This raises a question that Meg Hargraves is going to talk about later today that's really important. It's what we call collective efficacy. If we're not the only person working on this issue, if there are other organizations working on this issue, even the schools, how do we as a group affect the outcome for Turkey? How can we do better as a collective in moving this agenda forward? So the bottom line is that you're in a position to manage organizations, you have a lot of real-time data, you need to develop your long-term agenda for how you're going to convert this data to evidence and how you're going to feed that evidence back into the management of your organization. And you're going to have to be asking all the time, does this work? For whom does it work? When about it work? Where?